Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us on the Dairy Signal. I know for many it might be a day after a weekend or an extended weekend, but for many dairy farmers out there, you're thinking, well, it's just another day of work. But hopefully, you're enjoying the nice weather we've been having. And as we dive into today's topic, it is so applicable for many of farmers out there as we're talking about fall pasture management and what that really means. And we're joined this afternoon by an expert that many of you probably know if you're in the pasture world, and that is Jason Cavadini, who is a grazing outreach specialist with the University of Wisconsin-Madison Extension. So, Jason, we're excited to have you on here this afternoon to dive into fall pasture management. But for maybe those who might not be familiar with you, would you mind giving them a brief introduction about yourself?
Sure. Thanks, Amber. So I am uh my position is a grazing outreach specialist with UW-Madison Division of Extension. I've been in this role for over 3 years. I've been with the university for like 12 years now. Always kind of worked in the realm of soil and water conservation, but more specifically, how we can integrate that into our livestock production systems and specifically dairy production. I've always been throughout my career, I've been in north central Wisconsin where there's dairy farms all over the place. I'm surrounded by them. And so just kind of always focused on that intersection between conservation and agronomy and how it fits into dairy forage production systems. And so that's kind of what led me to this. And I'm actually in my office on my home farm that my wife and kids operate together, and we raise beef cattle on pasture here as well.
So you're fully immersed in what exactly you're talking about here today, which is amazing to have somebody who's not only in a position where they get to talk about and help others learn more about it, but you're putting it those words into practice here. And I have to say that's going to be a great episode, and I know today. And I want to remind folks that if they're watching live, that they can participate by asking questions. And depending on when the last time was you were on the Dairy Signal, you might have noticed that the question box has changed in location. So if you're looking to ask a question here this afternoon, head over to the bottom right-hand corner of your screen where you'll see the video playing, and you'll see three little dots. If you hit those three dots, you'll notice a little pop-up that says ask a question, and that is where you're going to ask your question. It does ask that you put a name, but honestly, if you put anonymous, a question mark, or anything else in between, we're just looking for you to ask a question. If you got one, it doesn't matter if you want to be associated with by name with that question. And I also have to say one more thing before we begin, because I know we're in September. And I know for many, this is the unofficial start of fall, but that also means that we still also need to thank our sponsor as they are through the month of December, or not December, September. Wow, I'm really jumping ahead in months, but they are our sponsor through September, and that is DMI, which is your dairy checkoff, and they are working at building sales and trust in the dairy through restaurant, retail, and food service partners, including youth outreach, research, and product development, and more. You can learn more about your checkoff and how they're making every drop count at dairycheckoff.com. So, with all that housekeeping out of the way, and with all of that information at your fingertips on where to go if you want to ask a question, Jason, I'm going to turn it over to you to get us started.
All right. And I'll add a couple other housekeeping things. So just so everyone knows, I did give Amber full permission to interrupt as much as necessary through this to kind of guide this conversation where it needs to go. And I also want to just throw out there that being the Tuesday after Labor Day and my kids' first day of school today, it's a little bit of being thrown back into the fire, and I kind of threw some of this stuff together hoping that it would all make sense, but if it doesn't, please ask questions. But today, since we are in September now, we're kind of changing our focus to fall pasture management. And oftentimes when we talk about management with pastures, it kind of seems like, well, how much managing in there? Is there? A pasture is a pasture. But Amber and I just had some conversation. There's a lot of these little nuances that make a huge difference in the end if you only know about them. So we're just going to talk about a few of those things today. So sitting in my chair as a grazing specialist, quote unquote specialist, I still learn on the fly all the time. I get questions all the time, and this time of year, Some of the main questions I get are have to do with what to do with that forage that's out there. How should we manage that? Should we mow it or clip it? Um, a lot of questions about weeds. Should we spray pastures for weeds? And that's kind of a Pandora's box of a conversation. Um, I'll kind of spoil it for you right now and tell you I'm not going to tell you whether or not you should spray, and I'm not going to give you any suggestions for products or anything like that. I'm going to let you come to that on your own, but I'm going to maybe help you think about it in a way that will give you some confidence in wherever you land. And then a similar question is, should I fertilize my pastures? And if so, when? And should I reseed my pastures? And if so, when? So these are all things that people start thinking about in fall. And in my mind, as you could probably have predicted, I never can give a straightforward answer. It's got to be that it depends type of answer. And it kind of depends on these things here. So this is what I put together. Now we could probably add 15 more things to this, but just in terms of managing our forage base very well. These are some of the things that we should be thinking about in fall. We should be assessing our current pasture and forage base and just kind of asking some questions. Is it what we want? Do we consider it good? Is it productive? What kind of maturity level is it at right now? Is the forage palatable? Would we consider these species desirable or non-desirable? Is it high quality, poor quality? Is it productive, unproductive? Are there weeds? These are all things that we should just think about because that can start getting us in the direction of where we want to land. Same thing with soil fertility. So we want to be able to understand the soil nutrient status. So I'm going to talk a little bit about soil testing. That's a really big part of it. You've probably heard before, if you're not testing, you're guessing. And that's the absolute truth with soil testing. Is it perfect? No testing method is perfect, but it's way better than the alternative of guessing. And it gets us in the right ballpark and gives us a direction that we can move toward. Also in fall, we want to determine our grazing plan for the remainder of the season. So in a lot of respects, our course has already been set for us now that we're this far along. But at the same time, there's a couple months of grazing left ahead of us. And so we have some questions to ask to get to the end. How long do you plan to graze? What is the current inventory of forage? How much do you have ahead of you? Is your goal to extend the grazing season as much as possible with something like stockpile grazing or grazing of annual forages or cover crops or perhaps crop residues? Those are all options. And then develop a pasture renovation plan. So we'll talk more about that, but you might think, well, my pasture's really nice. It doesn't need to be renovated. But even if you're doing the best job possible of managing a pasture, over time, it's going to need some sort of renovation because a lot of our legumes, they just don't last forever. And if we want to maintain them in the stand, we're going to need to do some sort of renovation. So what's a renovation plan that works for us? And then develop a soil fertility plan. So you might not actually end up doing any of these by the end of this talk, but I hope to point you in the direction of some resources that can help you do that. So I always have to start with just talking about management, and I'll just warn you, and if you've seen me before, you already know this, but you're going to hear that word out of my mouth more than any other word, and you might get sick of it, but it's the most important thing in all of agricultural production, but especially in grazing, because we all know we've seen really nice pastures, but we've also seen some pretty cruddy looking ones and everything in between. And what's the main difference? It's management. And it's all of those nuances that I alluded to earlier that there's small things that make a big difference in the end. Those all come down to management. So if we're rotating, are we rotating every 3 days or even more frequently? Are we leaving behind residual, or are we grazing right down to the soil surface? Are we allowing a rest period? Now, none of these, even that 3 days of rotation, like there's science behind those. It's not just made up. We don't want to be regrazing grass plants when they're starting to regrow, because now we're really setting them back, and they typically start regrowing within 3 days. Many of you have, if you have a hay field or an alfalfa field that's got orchard grass in it, you know what it looks like by the time you chop that. The grass already looks like it's grown a couple inches oftentimes. And that's really the period when we can really set a grass back, if we start grazing it again that early. So all of this is based on the physiology of grasses, and what the intensity at which we manage depends on how many of those R's, rotation, rest, and residual, we are implementing on our operation. And if we've got all three of them, then our intensity is at a pretty high level, but so is our production. So I say all of that to kind of preface everything that's going to come after this. Like, that is what I'm getting at when I talk about management.
So, Jason, before you move on and before we talk about fall specifically, let's stay on management for 1 second, because, if you're looking back on that and you're thinking, gosh, I might not have managed my pastures the best this year, or maybe I could do a little bit better. Does all of what's coming next still apply, or do you need to focus on the management portion first before you really dive into, I don't want to say thinking ahead, because you still need
Yeah.
to think ahead regardless, but does it impact or play a part in this conversation?
No, I think what comes after this is just going to maybe um, validate the need for the management more, or maybe just inspire you to try to pick some of those things. So, like, when we write grazing plans for people who are implementing grazing on a farm or a part of a farm for the first time, and they see those, they're like, holy cow, that seems really daunting, or that's a lot. And we'll say, don't worry about it. Pick one of them and do it. And often what we'll start with is say, that continuous pasture of yours that's usually out of grass by mid-August, figure out a way to subdivide it to just give them access to half of it. You'd be amazed at how much of a difference that'll make. And that's usually where we start. And if people do that, it kind of makes the light bulb go off, and then they want to do more. And so it's kind of a step-by-step thing. So if you don't have all that right, don't feel like none of what's after this applies. What this is going to do is just show why you should consider those things, and how much those things can help improve your pasture production. And I guess that is why I go back to management all the time, because we do have options to fix things that cost money, right? We could spray weeds, we could apply fertilizer, we could plant new seed. All of those are things that at some point along the way, a farm's probably going to do all those things. I'm not saying don't do those. What I'm saying is prioritize management before those, and see how far that can take you before you start doing that. Because especially on a pasture, we're really talking about a very tight profit margin practice. And so we really want to be absolute certain with full confidence that any input that costs money is necessary. So
Thanks. That really helps set the stage into moving on to what we're going to be talking to next. That it still applies, but think about maybe what you can start with if you haven't, or what can you continue to do. So I'll let you keep going here.
all right, so here we are at September. So we've got 2 months of grazing to go. So we're asking the question, how's our forage looking? So we're going to kind of start out there, the forage base. Well, when we think about forage, it's there for grazing, right? That is the feed. So the number one objective of this is to get that into the animal, whether we're talking dairy heifers or beef cattle or lactating animals. It's all the same. the forage needs to get into the animal. So the most important forage quality metric when we're talking about pastures are two words: intake and utilization. How much does the animal eat and how much of the pasture are they using? And so those things are really our biggest indicators of what kind of forage we have. They are influenced by palatability. And basically, what that term means is how much they like it, how much livestock are willing to eat it. In most cool season pastures, palatability is influenced by plant maturity. So, what we really want to see is a dense vegetative pasture that will maximize utilization and intake. So if we want to get as much forage into the animal as possible and efficiently use that pasture, we need to make sure that it's something that they like. And that is heavily influenced by the maturity of the plant. You can even see on the data in this table here that the digestibility goes down as the plant becomes more mature. This is something we're all well aware of, but it's the same in a pasture, and it's kind of a compounding thing in pastures through the duration of a grazing season. So here's kind of the same thing here. We've got some different types of cool season grasses here, so we can see they differ across the season in digestibility. They also differ by species. So there's some species that are just better than others. We know a lot of dairy farmers like meadow fescue if they're going to mix it into a stand of alfalfa because it is a better quality, better digestibility. But you can see how much digestibility influences intake. And here our intake numbers are different depending on the digestibility. And one more way of looking at that is just how important intake or digestibility is for intake. So in this case here, 19 pounds of dry matter per day is what's the baseline requirement for maintenance. That's like not growing, not producing anything, just staying healthy as you are. But if the animal is going to gain anything, we need more dry matter intake. And so this is why intake is so important. And if intake is heavily influenced by the maturity of the plant, that's one thing. The first thing when it comes to management that we need to understand, and probably the lowest hanging fruit for how we can gain the most. And so I'm going to explain that here. So if we've got a mature forage, we know that digestibility is really low and the palatability goes lower. Their preference for that plant is a lot lower. So they're going to be much more selective. Intake is going to be low. Utilization is going to be low. There's ways through the grazing season that we can deal with that mature forage. What our number one goal is to get that back to vegetative. So we see flowers on our legumes or we see seed heads. That's going to happen. It's not necessarily a bad thing if we see those, but then ultimately we have to get it back to vegetative. And so we can use high density grazing to trample it maybe earlier in the season. That's one way. Or we can clip seed heads after a grazing, or we can utilize cutting and harvesting, or we can do a little bit of all of these. But really, what it comes down to is forage quality is influenced by intake and utilization, and all of those are what result in more days of grazing. And that's really where we want to be when we hit September. September and October are the prime of the grazing season. And what we really want to do is make sure that we are positioned to make the most of what we call the fall flush. Grasses are going to be very nutritious right now, and they're really going to grow well. They're going to grow back fast. We might even be able to get 2 grazings yet out of this if we're rotating. And so how can we be positioned to take advantage of that and not be having to send the animals back to the barn because our pastures are done for the year? And that's really what we're trying to avoid here. So the question is, should I mow my pastures or should I clip them? Or should I spray my pastures if there's weeds? So if we think about what is a pasture, it's an ultra competitive growing environment. It's an ultra competitive ecosystem. It's tough for other things to grow in there as long as we don't give them a head start. So the biggest bang for our buck that we can get if we've got some weed issues in our pastures is to mow those, clip them, get them down below the canopy, and now the grasses are going to do the work and outcompete them. One of the things to consider when the question goes to should I spray is there are scenarios where it's bad enough that spraying is probably the best option. But if it's patchy and there's just areas that need to be addressed and it's not uniform over the entire pasture, it's going to be tough for an application of herbicide to be economical, especially this time of year because most species have already contributed back to the weed seed bank, and so they're going to come again next year regardless. And so this time of year, honestly, the best thing to do, unless it's a really bad outbreak, is to mow, get everything back to vegetative, let the grass outcompete the weeds.
So Jason, I feel like on this topic here, when it comes to weeds, I feel like, well, I guess when it comes to anything, there's always the question of, well, at what point or how do you know that there are too many weeds and do need to do some intervention, whether that be herbicide or any control in those ways. How or when do you make that call versus, as you mentioned here, knowing that it's gonna come back next year and you might have to do more of the management up front next year. So where's that balance?
That's a good question. I think that's going to come more into the conversation of renovating pastures, which we'll talk about a little later as well. But this may be the time of year where you decide it's bad enough that we might need to renovate the entire pasture, which might be burning it down and starting over or rotating a crop through there and then reseeding a new pasture. Now, there's a lot of things that we can do before we get to that point. So oftentimes I don't see pastures that are quite that bad. But I would say like this time of year, it would just be if there's it's going to depend on the species of weed as well. If it's something like a perennial grassy weed that you are just dealing with every single year, then it might get to the point where you do have to use herbicide to control that. But if it's an annual type, I think mowing is probably the best approach. So.
Okay. And then we had a question that came in during this time. And I do want to ask it because I feel like we can go in a lot of different directions if I leave it. But since they asked it during this mowing weed portion here, it reads, our pasture has some steep hillsides. We can't really use the tractors or any machinery on those slopes. Any suggestions to really maximize those locations with limited options?
That's describing a large portion of the western part. Well, not even just the western part of the state, but yeah, there's a lot of pastures that are like that where there's not a whole lot of options for what you can do with it. I would say, so it sounds like what they're describing is it might even be too difficult for mowing operations.
I would make that assumption.
Yeah.
How I'm reading it, I would make that assumption.
Yeah, so I have worked with some farmers with land like that where more recently they have been using herbicides just because mowing is not a very good or safe option for them. And they've been doing some drone applications with herbicide. I think it's probably going to be a multi-step approach for something like that. So one of the challenges with using herbicides is when you kill the stuff and you're successful, now you've got a lot of open ground that you've got to try to figure out how to fill in as quickly as possible. So you kind of have to think about both of those things together. and you might want to almost do them in sequence as well. So it might be worth considering doing the weed control in the spring, after the stuff starts taking off, and then trying to do some seeding into those as well. That would be that's a pretty challenging one. And if that person would ever want to reach out to me, I'd be happy to discuss that more. So,
I guess that's the beauty of when it comes to something like a pasture management is that there's not just a one size every scenario, every situation. And I know you mentioned that even up front that you can't have an answer for everything, but there's going to be better solutions. So good to know. We'll keep that in mind, and we'll hopefully that helped a little bit for the question that came in. But I'll let you keep going on here for the moment.
all right. So now we're going to turn a little bit to soil fertility. So we've got 2 months of grazing to go. So we've talked about our forage, but how do we think our soil fertility is looking? This is a little complex, a lot complex actually. And there's multiple reasons for that. But when we're talking about a system that I've been describing where we're rotating and leaving residual behind, and there's a lot of stuff kind of going in and out of the system. In these scenarios, up to 80% of the nutrients can be recycled back to the soil. Excuse me. So if that's the case, what do we need to put out there? So as I alluded to earlier, we really do need to start out with a soil sample. And so I probably get more questions about soil fertility and pastures than anything else. And I always start out by saying, what is your soil sample telling you? And I don't ask that because I'm gonna because I believe we can't do anything without that information, but it gets us in the right ballpark and just allows us to kind of think about where we're at and determine a direction that we want to go. So this is all kind of standard information. We want to come up with a representative sample. Many of you probably have seen this before. The one thing I want to point out, though, that I've been seeing more and more people not catch is when you send the soil sample and make sure you're giving them the correct crop code for a pasture, and whether or not it's a pasture and whether or not it has legumes in it. That's going to have a huge impact on the recommendation that they get back to you. Doing this wrong could end up in a recommendation that is going to be really expensive and you might not even need it. And so here's an example. I actually, even though I'm telling you this, I made this mistake this spring. I just dropped off a soil sample at the lab and then I must not have specified, and they sent the results back and they were for a corn, soybean, alfalfa rotation. Well, this isn't their fault, so I'm not blaming the lab at all. They cannot possibly follow up with everyone and say, are you sure you have the right crop in there? So I simply called them back and said, can you just put the right crop code in and then resend me the report? And you can see where the recommendation is slightly different now for each of these. Now, this isn't the greatest example because they're both in the optimum range, but if one of them would be, if it would swing one from low to medium or from medium to optimum, it could have some pretty big financial implications. And ultimately, it just won't be accurate for your soil. So I just wanted to point that out so it's something you're all aware of. Make sure you're indicating the right crop code. So there's a lot of soil nutrients that are very important, but the one that we are most concerned with for grazing and for pastures is potassium. Potassium is important to us because of the huge role it plays for legume persistence and winter survival. So there's about 150 pounds per acre removed if we're making hay in a given season, or if all we're doing is grazing, around 30 pounds per acre is removed. But we know that potassium is probably the most important nutrient for most of the pastures in Wisconsin. And I've just got a few things here to kind of demonstrate that. And actually, what this is demonstrating is because of how important potassium is for legumes, the role that legumes play. So, legumes end up being our number one source of nitrogen for our grasses. So, these green bars here are our grass yields where legumes are mixed in. And you can see that compared to grasses that don't have legumes. Here we've got a pure grass, and here's a grass legume mix. Where we have legumes in the pasture, we have 38% more nitrogen and 35% higher relative forage quality. So the point is there's a link between all of these. Without legumes, you don't have nitrogen, and without potassium, you don't have legumes. So it becomes that potassium ends up being the most important nutrient in our pastures for us to focus on. There's a ton of data here. Please don't get lost in this. But what I want to show you is this is one pasture that I've been tracking for several years, watching how phosphorus and potassium over the years. So you can see starting in 2019, it was a 4-year-old pasture, up through 2024 when it was a 9-year-old pasture. And you can see our levels climbing over time in that pasture. And on this next slide here, this is an actual picture of that from this August. So this is a 10-year-old pasture after it was grazed twice, clipped after the second grazing. So there's no mature forage or no mature plant parts here. There's no fertilizer applied. What this is demonstrating is how important management is before amendment, how far management can get us before an amendment is even applied. And so all I'm trying to get at here is how over time, as pastures are managed well, and as they age and become more established, we see these levels creep up on us. And so management is playing a huge role here. We also have our legumes here as our source of nitrogen. So if legumes are so important, how can we maintain them in our pastures? So there's different ways. A lot of people frost seed. This is probably the most used method in Wisconsin. And it's pretty simple, about 5 pounds per acre. That ends up being about 32 seeds per square foot. And about, on average, about a third of those will become established plants. And if you do that every few years, you'll keep your legumes in the stand. You'll have a source of nitrogen, and you'll have a source of crude protein in your feed. So I went through that pretty quickly, but to get back to that original question, should I fertilize my pastures and when should I do it? Well, here's my recommendation for starting out. Manage potassium to manage nitrogen. So we want to keep it there so we have legumes, which are a source of nitrogen. So just consider working into your plan about a third of your pasture acres each year, because red clover, for example, will last about 3 years. So if you do about a third of your acres each year, you'll keep your legumes in the stand. We also have other sources of potassium. So generally speaking, if we're rotational grazing, we're somewhere in the ballpark of 4.5 tons per acre, which is supplying about 32 pounds of potassium per acre. So if we kind of do all these things, we should be maintaining our levels fairly well. And so my recommendation would be to apply a removal rate of potassium in the fall. So you can utilize that for winter survival of those legumes. I'm going to show you one more way too busy slide, but I just have 2 things circled to make the 2 points that I want to make. in a system, in a grazing system, we've got imports and exports. We've got nutrients coming in and nutrients leaving. And so the question is, how much is left and how much do we need to apply? When we look at potassium, where we have grass and legumes and we're managed with managed grazing, we're ending up with needing about 30 pounds of potassium in a given year on our pastures. So that's just something to consider. You could do it every other year. You don't have to do it every year. You could build it up and then do it and then skip a year and do it again, or you could do 30 pounds every fall or something like that. But that's generally speaking in the ballpark of what we would need each year to maintain our pastures. I know I went through that really fast. Please ask questions if there was anything that was unclear. I'm going to talk a little bit more now just about the length of our grazing season. So we've got 2 months to go. Do we have enough to continue grazing? Can we continue going further? It starts with knowing how much we have there. So we call that a pasture inventory. You know how much forage you have, you know how many days of grazing it provides. We put together this resource. So anywhere where you see something like this, it's a resource that we put together. It's available at our website, which you can get with this QR code, or I'll share the address at the end. But basically what this does is it tells you how many days of grazing you have left. So you could technically go out there right now, follow the directions that we have in this publication, and it'll tell you exactly how many days of grazing you have ahead of you. But then the question is, can I extend the grazing season further than that? So there's a lot of ways that we can do that. We can do it with stockpile grazing, which basically means stockpiling our forage to graze it later when the grazing season would normally be over. It's maximizing our cheapest feed source. So it's also going to help us defer the use of winter feed. Typically, the way we do it is we cut and harvest in early August and then allow that pasture to regrow for about 60 days. And then when we get killing frosts that kind of turn off the rest of our pastures, we can move into that and graze that for as long as that'll let us go. So it'll be for however until we're out of forage or until it's completely covered with snow and ice. But that can take us sometimes into and completely through November. There's been some years where we've gotten well into December with stockpile grazing.
So, Jason, when we're talking about, I'm going to back up for a second in terms of what we're referencing, because I think stockpile grazing can have a lot of benefits and, like you mentioned, extending your forage options, which is amazing. But it says cut in early August, and we're past that. And maybe we're going to have a year like last year where it's warmer than average, and it has that 60 days of regrowth, and it'll be amazing, and it's still possible for this year. But if you're somebody who's thinking, gosh, I'm going to get to the end of the season, I really wish or I need to be able to, have some stockpiling of some sort. Is there any way that they can extend it if they do have good pasture management at this moment in time? Is there anything that they can do as of like now, September, I guess 2nd, not September 1, that might extend it a little bit more if they haven't thought to do so already?
Yeah. So our recommendation is cut in early August. That's what we kind of tell people for planning purposes. But obviously, how often it works out perfectly is not very. And so last year there were people who cut in the first week of September and were able to stockpile it because we had some pretty nice weather for growing. So that absolutely can work. You just have to understand that every once in a while there's going to be a year where you don't get the conditions for stockpiling enough. And that's typically why we just tell people shoot for August, but you might end up with something else, that shouldn't stop you from doing it. So
So there's still potential out here. That's what I'm hearing, the positive side
there
of
is. There is. And actually, my next slide, I'll add to that. So, despite what I said earlier about only focusing on potassium, there are some cases where nitrogen has its benefits. One of them would be stockpile grazing. Especially now if you do cut in the first week of September and you really want to try to get some growth to try to stockpile as much as you can, this might be a case where an application of nitrogen could go a long ways for you. So you can just see here across the board in our work, there was a 68% increase where 60 pounds of nitrogen were applied. So if that was done I would say, especially now, if you were to try to stockpile in September, put some nitrogen on, even if it's through manure. Typically on the work that we did at the research station, we use manure as the nitrogen source, but it could be fertilizer as well. There are other options for extending the grazing season. Cover crops, crop residues are all options as well, or just integrating some annual forages into the rotation. We put together this resource. I think it's like 14 or 15 pages, but it kind of walks you through the thought process and decision-making process for how to integrate cover crops and annual forages onto a farm for grazing. And it's got everything from planting methods to seeding rates in there. So that's available as well. And then continuing with the resource, I guess promoting our resources. So one thing that we see, and I mentioned this to you earlier, Amber, is just maybe not setting ourselves up for success from the start. If we're finding that it's September 1st and we don't have any pasture left, this may cause us to just ask, do we need to put a few less animals out next year? How much further would that get us? And that's what we call the carrying capacity. So how many acres of pasture do we have, and how many animals can those acres carry through the season? And this publication that we put together is intended for you start out with your goals. How long do you want to be out there? How many acres do you have? What forage do you have out there? What does it yield? And now you work backwards and you figure out on the 15th of May or whenever you start, how many animals do I start grazing? Because really, if we're going to make the most out of grazing and have it be the most economical, we want to, whatever animals we put out there, we want to keep them out there as long as we possibly can. Now that gets complicated with dairy animals, especially with heifers that are maybe coming into breeding age toward the end of the grazing season. But understanding how many animals we can put out there is actually really critical. And I would encourage everyone to do this every once in a while for their operation. So if we do find ourselves in that situation where we're out of forage, or this forage just isn't very good, it's underwhelming, then we start thinking about how can we improve these? Is a renovation needed? So again, we have a publication we put together to kind of help decide what renovation approach to go with for an operation. I do want to throw out one word of caution. A lot of people think that once we start getting into the dormant season of these cool season grasses, that we're kind of out of the woods where we don't have to worry about overgrazing anymore. But you can actually set a pasture back through the entirety of the following growing season by overgrazing at one time in October. That's what this data set here is showing. So they basically left this pasture at a 6-inch residual, and this one they grazed down to 2 inches. And these are the yields the entire next season. And it was depressed by 25% through the entire season, which then if you follow the math through, means that they could have 26% fewer animals on that pasture the following season. So there are still some instances where you may choose to overgraze on purpose. If you have a pasture that is not very good quality and you don't want to completely till it up and start over, but you want to try to get something else established in there. Let's say it's just really thick quack grass, for example. And some people love quack grass for grazing, but let's say you want to try to get some other grass in there. You can set it back or slow it down by grazing it very tight in the fall, setting it up to go in there with a no-till drill the following spring. But just don't accidentally set it back by grazing it too short. So that's the word of warning here. In that publication that I previously showed, I'm not going to walk through this table, but this is a decision-making table for depending on what kind of pasture you've got. If you've got a desirable grass with just thinning legumes, here's what you can do to get legumes back into your stand. If you have a desirable grass, but it's just thinning, period, well, here are some things you can do to renovate that. If it's an undesirable grass and it's patchy, here are some things you can do to fill that in. And then lastly, if it's an undesirable grass and it's like a thick sod, that's just a tough environment to get something else established, you may be starting over on that. But this kind of walks you through that. And then to take it one step further, and this is the last resource that I'm going to tell you about. This kind of completes that process. So the question then is, well, what should I plant in my pasture? So this publication helps you identify your soil type, your livestock type, what forage quality they require, and what species of grasses and legumes fit those objectives. So you're not choosing species that aren't very good for your soil type, and then you're getting really frustrated because it's a poor performer. We see that a lot. Something like meadow fescue has a pretty good reputation. It's gained popularity, but it's been put in some places where it's not intended to be. It doesn't perform very well there, and then people get frustrated with it. So we're trying to help people just avoid that mistake by choosing the right thing for their operation from the start. We want people to plant species that are compatible to their farm goals, but that also that are complementary to the other species that are already there. So what we mean by that is if we rate each of these species based on different things, we want them to be compatible to our soils or our grazing management. And we also want them to be complementary to whatever else is out there. So in that example I used, if you're going to graze a quack grass pasture really tight to try to get something else established in there, don't try to establish something that is on the other end of the spectrum in palatability, because what'll happen is your animals will always go to that thing that they prefer, and they'll graze that whether it's ready to be grazed or not, and they'll select it right out of your pasture, and you'll say, well, what did I spend the money on that for? And so these ratings kind of help you find things that are closer on the spectrum. So this is all that same information, but just on a spectrum here. So if we're looking at based on soil type or drainage, you don't want to choose things that are far apart from each other. You want to find things that are close to each other, so they are compatible to each other and compatible to your farm. So we can do that based on soil type. We can do it based on grazing management. We can do it based on palatability. I just wanted to show you how to think about this by showing you these. All of the information that's on these spectrums here is in that publication, What Should I Plant in My Pasture? And so I just want to encourage you to kind of look at that and decide what things are the best fit. There are some instances where people don't want to do that much homework. And so we kind of do have, we put together, this is also in that publication, some combinations that tend to be compatible and complementary most of the time. And we kind of put this one in the bottom left corner here as our coverall mix. So when people call us and say, what should I plant? And I say, well, what's already growing? And they say, well, grass. Well, what kind of grass? Well, I don't know. It's green. Well, I guess it's good that it's green, but what kind of livestock do you have? What's your management like? And what's your soil type? And if they say, I don't know what my soil is, then we'll say, this mix here probably has the best chance of working well on your operation. And so this is kind of the coverall mix here. I know that I went very fast through a lot of stuff. I hope that you can find some of those resources if you want to dig further into that. But if we kind of summarize all of this, what would be our tasks for managing our pastures in the fall? Well, I guess what I hope one take home for you would be keep pastures vegetative to get the most out of them this time of year, especially to make the most of the fall flush. This is the time where, in some of our research, we've seen dairy heifers gain 2.5 pounds per day during the fall flush. It's just phenomenal forage. And so let's try to set up our operations so we can make the most of that. And I hope that that's what you've heard kind of overarching all of this as the number one message is how can you take advantage of these last 2 months of grazing. One of them would be to just account for September and October when you calculate the carrying capacity of your pastures. That's something that you can't do much about right now, but I would just encourage you moving forward to look at that and make sure you're setting yourself up to take advantage of these months. Possibly consider extending the grazing season with stockpile grazing or annual forages. Consider maintaining potassium with fall applications of potash when necessary. And then develop renovation plans that fit your farm. And that to me is probably the next biggest one. Pastures are going to need to be renovated at some point. Make sure you're going with an approach that works for your farm. I do appreciate all of you listening today.
So, Jason, before we let you go, I have a couple extra questions here at the end. And one of them, I mean, we've got this really great checklist that you gave us, and we discussed a lot of things that you can do to really set yourself up for success for the remainder of the year and next spring. But if we're thinking about those folks who maybe have management under control, they are the A+ students when it comes to it, and they're thinking, well, here's a couple of the ideas that I'm going through, or maybe they're listening and they're thinking, there's a lot on this list. If you had to choose just one that would help a producer best set themselves up for success for next year, what would it be?
And you're talking for the A+, the people who already
Yep.
got all the management there.
Yep.
I think it would probably still be just improving the pasture productivity. It might be, we talk a lot about diversity of pastures, and I think one of the challenges with that are a lot of times people want to start out with a pasture really diverse from the start. Well, what ends up happening is what I was just advising you against is you end up with a whole bunch of things in there that maybe aren't the greatest fit or aren't complementary. And so we don't discourage people from trying to start out with diverse pastures, but what we really encourage people to do is let their pastures become diverse over time as they're managing them well. They will continue to become more diverse. And so that would be the thing. I guess I'm going to this is going to sound like a cop-out answer to your question, but I'm going to say just continue refining your management because the pastures will continue to be more productive over time. So those soil tests that I showed you from that one pasture over time that kept climbing, again, all that was management there. We don't even know like how far that can go. Um, the other thing that I'll mention is as a maybe second variant of my answer to your question would be to fine tune the soil fertility. And what I've been, some of the people who have a lot of experience with grazing, one thing I've been working on with them is sampling their soils when their pastures are humming on all cylinders. And the soil biology is at about its peak because we really want to understand that how much is that system producing and then how much do we have to contribute after we account for that. So that's something that I'm very interested in scientifically. So on the professional side of things, I'm kind of building plans for exploring that further. So
Well, Jason, I think those are really good areas to be thinking about. And I don't think it's a cop out to say go back to your management because it sounds like whether you're new to this or very well experienced in terms of grazing, that there's always ways to tweak and be better at managing the pastures that you have. So I think that's a fair place to set things. But as we wrap things up here this afternoon, and maybe it is going back to the basics, but if you had to give producers one thing to be thinking about after they leave today's episode, what would that be?
I think it would be to just identify like if you are if you feel like you're not quite set up to fully take advantage of the next couple months of grazing ahead of you, just pick one or two of the things that I mentioned and maybe the ones that feel most attainable and just kind of resolve to do those next year and spend the year or the off season kind of preparing for how you're going to implement that or how you're going to tweak your operation to do that. And then if you feel like you're already doing all those things, continue identifying ways to refine it because there's always ways to continue refining it.
Well, Jason, I have to say thank you so much for your time here this afternoon. It has been a pleasure, especially since there's always so much to learn and there's always so much that's happening in the world of grazing. And I know that as somebody whose family does it just a little bit in comparison, there's always something that nugget of wisdom, whether you're new or old into it, that can really be helpful. So thank you so much for your time here this afternoon.
Yeah, no problem. Glad to be here.
I also have to say, as we wrap up, thank you once again to DMI for being our sponsor currently on the Dairy Signal and making programs like this possible. But if you're wondering and maybe trying to get out in person, we have got a whole slew of programs coming up here this fall. And I can say fall now because, like I said, it's the unofficial start after September 1, at least in my personal opinion. And we've got a great list, including Stride for Youth, which is coming up in November. We've got a whole slew of business management and financial literacy workshops coming up this fall, Calf Care Connection, and so much more. So if you're wondering when those are, trying to get those calendar dates all scheduled out now, I would really recommend heading over to our website at pdpw.org to learn more. But for now, thank you for joining us here today, and we'll see you here Thursday on the Dairy Signal. Bye now.